Thank you, everyone. Thank you, James, for inviting me to be here at UNT. It's a pleasure to come here and talk to you all. My work is about adaptation, and the forms are inspired by plant and animal anatomy. I'm using reductive wood carving processes and metal wire inlay to reference hair or cells within the body or body ornamentation. But what I want to do today is show you a little bit about how I got to this point. When I started graduate school, I was only really interested in raising and forming in traditional metalworking techniques. I loved working with the vessel. I wanted to create these little voids, these objects with a hair or a skin-like texture, but then they had this deep, dark cavity on the inside. As a metalsmith, I also wanted to incorporate some jewelry into it. So my next attempt is to reduce the scale. So those last ones were anywhere between 5-6 inches. And then these ones, I was customizing the tools. So I was making tiny versions of raising stakes, tiny hammers. And the big one on the left is about 1.5 inches tall. And so that makes the little silver one on the right about the size of a thimble for your pinky. Very tiny little pieces. The idea was make them small enough so that they could be on the body. But what I found in that process was I lost a lot of the surface movement that I liked. I no longer had that nice repetition of that hair and the skin. So I needed to try something different. So I was in graduate school and I spent a lot of time in the wood shop, and I made these pieces. One's a strum stick and a dulcimer. And what I learned from this process is I could take the wood, I could cut it really, really thin and fabricate this negative space, this hollow form inside. And while the piece is about 4 feet long, it's still very, very lightweight. But I didn't really understand how to combine that until I did this workshop at Penland School of Crafts. While I was there, I was assisting my professor, Bob Ebbendorf, and they have 2 metal studios. So the one was kind of found objects, mixed media, and exploration of materials. And the second one was this woman, Susan Chin. And I got an opportunity to spend a little bit more time with her, and she does bone carving and wood carving, and then this metal inlay technique. And so she really showed me that maybe what I needed to do was step away from just metal in order to represent the forms that I wanted to create. And so this was the very first piece where I'm trying that. This is like the vessel extending from the body. It still has that tiny little spout, that opening, but I'm getting a better representation of hair on the surface than I was with just chasing and the metal techniques. In jewelry, there's this idea of sentimentality. And the front is what the viewer sees. The back is this personal space that's only there for the wearer, and if they decide to, they can take it off, they can show anybody else that they want to. So I wanted to take that back and I wanted to pull it away from the body, encapsulate it. So this is like a sexual organ or a fruiting body that's coming off, and what's inside is just barely opening up. All of those silver wires are the hairs brushed towards the opening. And then what's inside is still sort of a mystery to both the viewer and the wearer. And so now it's time, as these are my first few pieces, to experiment and explore with scale, with materials. So these ones now have gold wire. I'm using ebony African blackwood. This one is dyed lemon wood with 22 karat gold. And still taking this form, this bulbous, ripening form, and pulling it away from the body. With adaptation, one of the things that I've always been interested in is these grotesque forms. And this one, the imagery is coming from like a leech sucking on the body, or this dissection of an intestinal organ, something from within the body, this little capsule, this bulbous shape. And what I like about that is with jewelry, it becomes precious. And with the materials, there's this preciousness about it. So taking these sort of grotesque images and turning it into something that I value. There's a reason that I spent time to carve this piece and have it on the body. I put this one up here so you could see a little bit about my process. To get these pieces, I'm working with wood so I can carve it, but I'm still on the body, so I need to think about the weight and the balance of the pieces. This one, it started by being cut into quarters. So you can imagine through one of those tentacles, each one is cut in half, and then through the middle of the piece is cut in half. And so I'm hollowing that out and then reassembling. After I do that, I do all of the gold wire and the gold leaf on the surface. Reassemble those two halves and then paint it. So what that does, the whole reason to do that is I drew the design and then I realized I still need to make it lighter. So I hollowed those forms out. And that's one of the things that I like the most about this process is do your design, do all the drawings, and then figure out the best way to fabricate that piece. So the last one and this one are both stemming from cacti. I love the imagery of this kind of spiny, bristly surface, but also the way that they thrive in an extreme environment, right? They live in a place that most organisms can't survive, and they basically only live there. And not only do they live there, but they reproduce, and they've carved out their own little niche in that ecosystem. Okay, so still exploring and continuing to figure out what are the limitations of this new material that I'm exploring. This piece mutation is a sculptural object, so it's about 3 feet long. And I wanted to see if I take it away from the body, how can this move? How can I get a better flow through the form? And how do the materials respond at this different scale? This to me is sort of like, again, another intestinal organ cut out of the body, thrown on a table, but then it's starting to slither away and start its own new life. There's a butt shot. Still got all the wire. So on a different scale, the same gauge wire, how does it look more like hair when it gets on a bigger surface? So this was about 2009, and I was living in North Carolina, and at that time was one of my role models, one of the people that I always looked to whenever I was working. Martin Puryear had a retrospective at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. This was an incredible opportunity for me to see these pieces in person, to not only see them from a 3-inch picture in a book, but to walk up to this 7-foot-tall sculpture, see the curvature of the form, walk around it, see the texture and the craftsmanship that went into each piece. This one in particular really stuck with me. On the screen, it's this kind of just black swooshing form. In the gallery, it's slowly cresting out of the surface of the floor before submerging back down in. It's almost like it is the curvature of a larger form that's breaking between 2 dimensions, as though it continues through the floor into the space below. So getting back to my studio, I went and made this piece in response. This one to me is like the back of a whale as it's cresting the surface of the ocean, coming up for a breath of air before resubmerging back down into the depths, into the world that we can't see. So to me, the interesting part of adaptation is this changing process, but also the unknown, the places we can't get to, the things we can't see. Another part of adaptation that I'm drawn to is how humans have changed. What kind of limitations and cultural signifiers do we employ? I'm looking at the way people in different cultures use hair as this social signifier, whether it's groomed or shaved or plucked from the surface like this one. And in this piece, I drilled all of those holes, but then never inlaid the wire, as though each hair from the body was pulled out. I'm also trying to explore the format of the piece. Previously, I was doing sculptures and brooches, and now I wanted to see what are the limitations that are imposed when I put it around the neck. So a necklace has different rules about it, and I have to adapt my forms in order to fit that format. I'm thinking of these in addition to the way that we manipulate hair, but as individual colonies. So you could think of them as clusters of people, or I was thinking of microorganisms, or maybe even like a coral reef. But the way that we live in this connected environment and are competing for resources and are either working together or against each other. And then the last one of this group has all of the wires evenly groomed and trimmed on the surface. And then these two bulbous forms, while they are completely opposed to each other, are still connected and have to work together. These two brooches, walkie and talkie, were made from the same block of wood. They were carved out at the same time, wire inlaid at the same time. And I think of them as either a satellite dish or possibly the human ear. And I was thinking about those connections that we have with people, the ones that are really important in our lives. Who are those people that are most important to you? And they might not necessarily be the ones that you see on a daily basis. They might be those people that live far away and you talk to once a week or once a month or even once a year. But anytime you hear their voice, you pick up right where you left off. So these brooches, while they were carved and worked on at the same time, and then they go off to the gallery, they end up in different collections. Different people have them, and they might be across the country or across the world from each other, but I like to envision that they still have this stream of communication going back and forth between the two. So one of the things that I really enjoy doing are these small rings. And on Friday in the metal studio, we're going to be doing a ring workshop. For me, it's sketching in 3D. So I'll do lots of drawings before I start any piece, but I can also do this to see how the form works in the round. I can spend like half a day carving a piece and see if it's going to work before bumping up the scale. So in addition to just trying out these pieces three-dimensionally, I'm experimenting with materials. The last one was pink ivory, which is a type of wood, African blackwood, ebony, holly, and I'm seeing what does it look like without the wire? What about these bulbous smooth forms? Or like with holly, it's this bone white finish. Leaving it like that and getting the bone effect, or do I dye it? Do I gold leaf it? Do I paint it? So it's a quick exploration of a different material, a different form. This one, the pink ivory, it is a wood, and I found this bright red color. It's really meaty, really lush. So if I want to, I can occasionally use this, but it tends to overwhelm the piece. So only when I want to have that really vivid, bright red look do I bring this into my work. And then also the idea of value. Ebony is known to be this valuable, exotic, rare wood. But what about when I compare it to something like Osage orange, which grows here in America and is everywhere, and it has this really detailed grain to it, right? The grain could maybe be overwhelming to the piece. So I have to think about how is that going to play on the surface, especially when I go on a larger form. Whereas the African blackwood and the ebony, they stay really black, and when I file and sand and then lacquer the pieces, they almost look like this plastic form, as though they were just cast in place. And what I really found that I loved was this combination between holly and African blackwood. Holly giving me so many opportunities to leave it as this bone effect, or I could dye, paint, gold leaf, and do it in so many different ways. So this really kind of honed in what I was working with between those two kinds of wood. So the drawing process, it's still really important to my work. And regardless of what media you find yourself working in, it's probably going to be an important part of your practice. What it allows you to do is make all of those mistakes before you invest a bunch of time into actually fabricating the piece. So this is a full-scale drawing of the necklace, and you can see where I'm just trying to figure out the balance. I want to know where each of these little bulbs is going to be and understand the weight of it before I start cutting it out of wood. And then, like with any precious material, you know, as students, I'm sure you find that every project that you're doing involves some sort of cash investment. With metal and wood, I have that same thing. So I'm trying to conserve it. I'm trying to push all of these little components to one side, figure out the best way to cut each one out, and then also understand that there's a grain direction to the wood. If I want this to be strong, they have to go from top to bottom. And then I have to figure out how I'm going to get a bandsaw blade through all of this. So I love that process of the design, but then breaking it down and understanding how you're actually going to construct the piece. Then, once everything's cut out, I can see and I can feel the weight of each component. I can say, this is maybe a little bit too heavy. I need to remove some material, or there's too many links, and I need to take some of those out. So through lots of just experimenting and replacing components, I can start to understand how it's going to work on the body. After a lot of carving, a lot of wire inlay, jump forward, and then it looks like that. That's the finished piece. So in 2009, I went and I worked for this company, Hoover & Strong, and I worked there for about 5 years. This was after graduate school. What I was doing there was a little bit of everything we did in gold and jewelry manufacturing. So I started as a polisher, I did bench work, and then by the time I left, I was supervising the jewelry division. And it allowed me to experiment with metalsmithing techniques. So it allowed me to work with gold and platinum on a daily basis to the point where I had no fear of that precious material. Like owning the materials that you work with, knowing how they're going to work, and not feeling like you're going to destroy it was the biggest thing I picked up from working there. At the same time, I was working there, I was living in Richmond, Virginia, and I would teach night classes at Virginia Commonwealth University. That allowed me to take those techniques I was picking up and then share those with the metalsmithing students. And then this is a shot of my personal studio. Again, so this is right after graduate school. I got kicked out. I no longer had all of those excellent metalsmithing and woodworking facilities, and this is how I figured out what I needed to do in order to keep my work going. So I've got my bench, I've got a bandsaw, I've got an anvil. And I just built up component by component to get myself up and running. Because that's what you're going to have to do once you leave here, is figure out what do you need in order to keep working? What do you need in your studio space? And it might be just buying one piece of equipment at a time. So while working at Hoover and teaching those classes, I kind of got my jewelry fix. So back to the sculptures. I wanted to, again, experiment and see what happens when I work on a larger scale. And the next few pieces are going to be in that 10-inch to about 2-foot range. So these are a different wood. It's maple that's painted black because I still wanted that deep, dark, kind of luscious surface. I was carving textures, and I was still inlaying that silver wire. This one to me is either something emerging as a new organism, like a butterfly coming out of its chrysalis, or being devoured. So there's that conflict. Is it coming out, or is it the beginning of life or the end of life? The forms, again, are coming from these intestinal shapes, these new creatures, these kind of awkward, weird-looking things that are just moving off and starting their own new life, some of which just, maybe he has too many orifices for his own good. Or, again, back on the wall, and this idea of breaking between planes. Think of like a taxidermied head, where you see a deer on the wall, and you could sort of imagine the rest of the deer existing in this other space. What kind of creature would be behind the wall here? And then calling back to where it all began. I was thinking about instruments, the violins, the strumsticks, the dulcimers, and the top portion is carved like the head of a violin, very ornate and crisp. And then as it moves away from the wall and kind of wiggles and starts to morph and become this bulbous shape, growing hair, and you can see it pointing off in a new direction, not quite sure where it's looking. This to me is probably the most representative piece of a pitcher plant. I love that kind of seductive opening, that ridge along the top, the thing that lures insects in, and this role reversal of the natural world where these plants are devouring animals. So as it's going down, it's transitioning and it's becoming an animal itself. And then again, that opening, it seems to come back over and over. It's my connection with these organic forms, and then a callback to where I started with the vessel and the relationship between the inside and the outside of the body. This one I wanted to see, how does it move away from the wall? So it has a bracket attaching it. And then as it curves down, it becomes about 3 inches away, and the whole thing is supported by that one back plate. Then, see how does this form work when it's on the body. So that is 3 inches tall, and this piece is closer to 2 feet tall. And you can see the difference with the wire and how much I can get into the surface and carve the shape, right? So I love that play between scale and coming back and forth between sculpture and wearable objects. So in addition to going back and forth between those formats, I'm also looking at the pieces I've made in the past. So one of the opening slides was a green piece called Mutation. And it was 3 or 4 years later, and I wanted to see what would happen if I reapproached this form. So I don't want to recreate it exactly, but how can I interpret that and do something different? But also examining, how has my studio practice changed? What have I learned as an artist? What mistakes have I made along the way? That's a big one. All of those scrap pieces that go into the trash bin that feed into the developments of the next piece. So this one and this one is re-examining the forms and seeing what works and ditching the things that don't. And then always, I seem to be coming back to the vessel. It's like how we all walk around in the world and there's this part of us that everyone else sees. There's this opening that alludes to this hidden component, the things that are going on in your brain that you only share with the world if you choose to share. And now, just because I needed another challenge, decided to ditch wire completely. I was relying on it too heavily, and I wanted to see if I'm not doing wire as this hairy surface or these cellular structures, how can I represent this texture? And so what I started doing was ditch the wire, and I took these tiny little chisels, these little jewelry chisels that are called gravers, and I was carving these detailed feathers or scales into the surface. Again, this piece is about 3 inches tall. And this scaly texture on this one, the wood is green, right? This is called lignum vitae. And when I'm carving, it's a really dense wood, but it starts out as orange or brown. And then as it's exposed to light and air, it starts to turn green, which I think is a really cool feature of this wood. So if I have to put this piece in an exhibition and I've got it stored in a drawer at home, I pull it out and it's brown. And then I put it on the windowsill, and after a couple of days, it turns back to green again. So I love that even without me working on the piece, it's got its own new life. It has its own transitions. So I was feeling like, as I removed the wire from my work, this piece is sort of like a self-portrait. So it was bound by the wire, and then I've clipped it away. And in each decision that you make, each piece of work that you make as an artist informs everything else. So even though I've removed the wire, and I've grown with it, it still has left its imprint on the surface. So regardless of how I felt about it, it's still determining the way I go with each consecutive piece. This one to me is that relationship between the man-made world and the natural world. So I have these ebony chain links that are carved as the necklace that sort of bind it to the body. And then coming from that is this carved holly bulb. And it could be interpreted as, in the man-made world, there's this little bit of life that's coming out that's either fighting against that construction or possibly working with and developing with it. And then another challenge. I've never really brought that much color into my pieces, right? And if I had, it was one uniform color. I like to keep it to about 2 or 3 different elements that I'm working with at a time. Because on the jewelry scale, it's really, really easy to just have this brain fart of information go onto the piece and then it not make any sense. So what I had to do if I'm trying to put color on the surface, I had to remove some of that movement of form. So all of these became these ovaloid, these monolithic shapes. I was carving the surface with a little gouge, and then I would layer up one coat of paint at a time and let that dry. So I would go blue and then dry, orange, yellow, blue, orange, yellow, and keep layering and layering and layering to the point where I had no idea what colors were underneath. So spending about a week doing one coat of paint after another. And then it was the big reveal. So bringing a little bit of mystery back into the work. I grab a piece of sandpaper and I start sanding down, and you see the further I go, I'm going layer after layer and I'm revealing what the piece is going to look like. And it provided this little bit of excitement, not knowing when the piece was finished. Until you see at the top, I'm actually sanding back down to the wood and I've gone all the way through the paint layers. I think of these like little microcellular, microscopic organisms. And they're all working in this one big blobby amoeba. And then, like I said, when I put everything back together, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And here's me trying to put wire and paint and movement and surface texture all into one piece. And sometimes you just have to do this in order to see, will it work or won't it work? In 2014, I moved here. This is Lafayette, Louisiana. This is a little swamp in the middle of our campus with some alligators in it. I don't know if you can spot any in there. There's about 5 or 6. What I do really love about living in Louisiana is that you can go 10 minutes outside of town. I can get in a kayak and I can go out in the middle of the swamp. I don't hear any cars, I don't hear any people. And the only thing around me is this look, minus that building in the background, and the alligators, the snakes, the fish, the birds, just nature around me. And I feel like I'm stepping back in time into this kind of primordial space. About the same time that we moved to Louisiana, my wife's dad had open heart surgery. He had a congenital heart defect, which basically meant that one of the valves in his heart was in the wrong place from birth. And so his whole life, he'd lived with it, not really knowing that he had it, until he was in his 60s. And then it became this critical moment of, you either have open heart surgery or you're gonna die. And it started to make me think about adaptation and evolution in a different way. In a way that there's not a design about it. It's a trial and error process. Did you live long enough in order to have children, right? If you did, congratulations, you've survived and you've contributed to evolution. If not, then those mutations, those characteristics are lost. So I was thinking about the blood within our body. This is like an artery that carries the life force through our bodies and keeps us alive. Or possibly like the bark on a tree, the thing that conveys water and nutrients to keep it living. And so it's all cored out. What happens when that is gone? This one like a bone fragment and the marrow is removed. and there's that remnant of what brought life before. But as it is now, it's this dried and cracked and dead object. But what if it doesn't die? So carving this one out of ebony and doing that silver wire inlay on the surface, and I'm thinking about that artery cut out of the body, but then it managed to survive somehow and is moving and starting its own new life. Let's see, this was 2016. In the beginning of 2016, I went to Penland School of Crafts with a group of other metalsmiths, and we went in the middle of winter and completely isolated ourselves in an attempt to spur some new innovation in our work. And before we went, we were asked to boil down what it is that we make to one word. Take everything that you've written in your artist statement and scrap all those extra sentences and say, my work is this. Right? So it could have been adaptation or evolution, but I thought the root of all of that was sexual. So I show up and my word is sexual, and we get there, and then for that whole week, we're not allowed to use that at all. And we all had to swap words with each other. The word that I got was inspiration. Okay, that's everything. So it seemed like this really easy process. Okay, cool, inspiration, I can make anything that I want to. But then also sort of this daunting, I have nowhere to begin here. I can draw anything, and that's my inspiration. So I spent the first half of the week just kind of thinking and freaking out about it and trying to understand, where is my inspiration really coming from? So I thought, now that I've started working with this idea of flaws or perceived flaws, how does that relate to our daily lives? I started thinking about how humans are a little bit past, we don't have, if we walk out our front door, you don't have to be worried about a tiger taking you out, right? We're not gonna die by competition. There's this excess in our daily lives. So I started thinking about how that excess influences us. And this body of work started to become about that excess, the fat folds, the hairy kind of gross carved surfaces. And I made these little fatty bulbs. They're heavily textured, like these pockmarked skin, but I don't think that it was just about the ugliness of it, but it was showing what beauty is still there. Here's another one, and you can see the way it's all going together. So it's this chain running through the form, and it can slide back and forth along that chain. And then the one that's maybe like a crease between your thumb and your fingers, or like your elbow as it's bending, and that skin folds. And then I made this one. This was probably the most recent piece. This is, again, like the one that was all the black chain link. This very manufactured, uniform, man-made link. And then emerging from it are these gold leaf growths. So it's a lot more optimistic than the last one was. It's definitely showing signs of growth and evolution and change, but then also sort of this hope for the future. And then the last one that I have is this piece, just because I need to try something else. I still think I'm working with adaptation with the vessel, but in this one, I've ditched all my other materials. It's copper, it's enamel, and then cast resin. So think about the vessel. I wanted to highlight that relationship between what the world sees and what's hidden within. And this one acts as a magnifying glass on the body. The bubble is so large that it magnifies everything, and it makes it so that you can't hide what's behind it. That's visible to the viewer. But inside that copper frame is gold leafed. So if you're not right in front of it, if you're not really looking for it, you see this dazzling glow of gold. And that's my last image. Thank you. So now if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah.
So the first few pieces you had, like the first two slides, the objects looked like they were floating. Could you explain how you kind of document those?
Sure. Can I flip back? I'll just do this. These pieces?
Yeah.
Yeah, so these were photographed on a gradient background, and this was a long time ago. They weren't actually floating, but I may have had a glass piece underneath them so that you couldn't see that shadow where they were connecting to the surface. This has been a trial and error thing along the way of being too broke to afford a good photographer and trying to figure these things out myself. And then occasionally spending that money and hiring a really good photographer and then sitting in on those lessons and trying to apply it to my own work. So I could say, where is it? This one. It was a different scale. I had no idea how to photograph the piece. So I found a photo student when I was in grad school, and I made him a little brooch, and he photographed this piece for me. And then I got to watch him do it and figure out how I'm going to do that the next time. Yeah.
I'm interested in the piece you cut out for the necklace of the wood. You said you didn't know how you were going to get it to the bandsaw. Well, when you were done and you showed the pictures of it, how thick were those before you started carving?
Yeah, these were all cut out of a block of ebony that was about 1.5 inches thick. So you're seeing it from above here and it just looks like that thin sheet, but it's actually that thick. And one of the things you can see in this image is the beads are very narrow in some parts, but I'm just showing you this one step in the process before I start to reduce the thickness of them. So the first step was just get it out of the block of wood, and then I'm doing this reductive carving process with burrs and chisels and making each piece flow into the next one, into the one that was before it, and then also feel like the right weight and understand how that's going to work. But it's slow, and it takes that carving, and it takes feeling and holding each piece to get to the right point.
So on your next slide, of the smallest beads, if they are, or of the smallest forms, how big do those end up from the original?
I'd say there's the clasp in the back is that toggle, and then the bead right before it is maybe 3/4 of an inch long and about 1/4 inch wide. They're tiny, and I'm trying to hold it and then carve it with these power tools. Yeah. Yeah.
Are they open and hollow on either side?
No, these are all completely encapsulated. So if I do hollow something out, like that big bulb right in the middle, that was hollowed out. And I cut it in half, again on the bandsaw, hollowed everything out, and then I glue it back together and carve everything on the outside. Yeah.
Why did you decide to only hollow out the first piece?
All the way to the back?
Yeah.
I think that was the idea of sentimental space, of it coming away from the body and actually being a connection to the wearer. But then I became more interested in hiding that from the wearer. So there's that part of it. The other one is a technical part where they're all brooches and they have to have a pin back, and trying to figure out how that's going to connect to your clothes. And making them completely encapsulated gave me the whole back of the piece to work with again. So it's 2 parts. But I don't think I would have ditched that just out of convenience.
Yeah.
It had to work with the form as well. Yeah.
How much time did you spend on each piece, like varying between the rings or necklaces or the bigger pieces?
So the rings are very quick. They take me maybe a half a day. And pieces like this, or the last necklace I showed that was white with the gold on the surface, can range up to 100, maybe 150 hours of work put into them. And when I'm working in the studio, I just kind of walk in and I just say, I got here at 3, I left at 8, and I add that to it. And so that's my only way of keeping track. That big white sculpture in the beginning took me about a month, and I didn't remember to document any of that. I just went, well, this took me January, so that's about how much time it was. Yeah.
I really love how you incorporate the texture into your pieces. Do you use any like photo references when you're creating those?
That's a good question. I think I'm not directly pulling from photographs, but any opportunity I get, I love going to aquariums. So if I'm in a new city, I can go to an aquarium. I go to Atlanta a lot, and I get to go to the Atlanta Aquarium, which is this massive space. And I'm looking at all of the weird oddities, these creatures that you can't even believe exist. The jellyfish tank where they're all floating around in the space. So that's where I'm pulling from for inspiration. That or like documentaries. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you share with us a little bit about, so you're teaching and you have, so many things, but then you need to find time for your studio time. So can you share with us a little bit from, your schedule or how you plan or how you commit to your studio time?
Yeah, that was when I showed that I was working at Hoover and Strong and I was teaching classes, and then I was trying to fit in the studio too. Right? As artists, you want to be in the studio probably all the time. But you have to find that balance between what's paying your rent and getting in the studio. So for me, it was really making sure that I got the work I was supposed to do done before I ran off and played in the studio. I think you have to have a passion for being in that space. And now's your time to figure that out as students. What studio do you want to be in all the time? And that's the one that you should probably pursue and continue with your time here. Now that I'm teaching full-time, it's sort of required that we do have this studio practice. So I get 1 day a week that is supposed to be my studio day. I was told when I first started teaching that I wasn't going to make a piece for the first year, but that sounded terrible. So I just continued to work every night and then work on the weekends as much as I could. I think the message there is that I don't have a lot of hobbies. I go kayaking, I go out in the swamp, and then I work in the studio. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think time-wise, anyone else that has any other questions for Daniel, we can certainly gather outside the halls. We get out of the way at the next class, and you guys need to get on to your other classes, but we can certainly chat out in the hallway. So thank you again for a great talk.
Thank you all for coming.